Mr. Moyer, listen, I want to thank you so much for being a part and being patient with this lesson. We're going to start doing more of these as we get better at doing them, but thank you so much for being a part of the site, winning this lesson, and me being able to communicate with you. I know this is going to help. You're typical of what most players are, and the typical parts come from where our industry tried to fix problems that weren't really the problem. So what they went after was effects. And while the way they tried to fix those effects actually made people, I don't want to say worse, but it made it harder for you to be consistent with your swing. So it's a pleasure to have the opportunity to work with you. I know this is going to help you out a bunch. So watch it, see what it does, give us some questions on the site, and thanks again for being involved with Malaska Golf. Overall, golf swing's really pretty good, and I love your backyard. What a nice setup. You've got to hit balls out there into the trees. I used to do that as a kid. I'd hit them out into a field, but that's a nice place to practice. You don't need to hit real balls, just get some plastic golf balls. And so, or balls that only go like 40 or 50 yards. There's control distance balls that no matter how hard you hit them, they go about 30 or 40 or 50 yards at the most. But anyways, nice setup. Now, relative to what I see in your swing, your grip looks really pretty good. But here's what I find with most people. As soon as they start trying to turn their hand, which is how their arm hangs anyway, they start here and then they try to turn their hand with their shoulder. So you start seeing a lot of tension in your shoulder. So what I want is you want your grip on there, but if you look at my shoulders and my shoulder sockets, just because my arm is turned, which is how it hangs naturally, there isn't any tension in my shoulder socket. In my right arm, again, it comes in and it sits in there, and how much tension is in my shoulder sockets? Well, there's virtually none. What I see is a little bit of, even though your grip's pretty good, it looks a little twisted this way with your shoulder and a little here. So everything looks a little tight. Now, as soon as these shoulder sockets tighten up at all, you have to feel this. I mean, I was a swimmer, I was a baseball player. So all of this arms and shoulder sockets relaxed. I got that. I didn't ever want my shoulders to be tense, because if I tensed my shoulders and tried to swim butterfly, you can't move. If I tried to throw a ball and I tighten my shoulder, see, even though my arm, see, everything starts to work together. There has to be this free-flowing motion. So one is get your grip on there where there's no tension in your shoulders, and make some swings where you don't feel any tension come into your shoulder sockets. So you can have a relaxed grip and tight shoulder sockets. So the key is these don't tighten up. So that's number one. Number two, when you set up to get your hips to move the way they're supposed to, and this was an old adage from years ago, they told everybody, because everybody tended to sway a little bit. Why did they sway? Because the concept was you want to shift your weight to your right foot and shift your weight to your left foot. No, bad concept. You're not moving weight, we're moving force. So here's what we're trying to do. You're trying to move force into your right foot and force into your left foot. Now, to do that, my right hip has to be able to move out of the way. So my hip has to be able to rotate. My hip socket has to be able to turn. Here's what you do. When you set up, you kick your knees in a little bit. And that was, for a long time, that was taught. Stand on a golf ball, put your knees in so you don't sway. Well, that locks your hips, so now they can't move. So you want to feel like if I was to stand here, if I was going to get ready to jump, if I just flex my knees a little bit, that's where you want to be. You don't want your knees kicked in, because the muscles that kick your knees in lock your hips. So the other thing is get the tension out of your shoulders and get it so when you set up to the ball, there's no kick in this way with your knees, which locks your hips, which is causing some of the problem you're having. Now, when I watch you take the club away, if I were to put a stick right here, and I got set up to the ball, and you saw the distance that stick is from me. When I start my backswing, pressure goes into my right foot, but where does my hip appear to go? It appears, and it actually does move away from that stick. So I'm moving force into my right foot, okay, but my right hip isn't going back with it. All right, now some of that comes from your knees are kicked in, so when you try to move, when you go back, your hip won't turn, so it slides a little bit. So your right hip doesn't move at all, your right hip socket. So here's what tends to happen. If all of a sudden I kick this in to keep me from swaying and my right hip socket doesn't move at all, then as I go back, your hips are going to turn to some degree. So what happens? Your left hip moves out. Now this hip has stayed there, but now this one's moved out, which has moved your center closer to the ball. And what does that cause? That causes you to stand up. It also causes the club to go out away from you too much. So what the tour players do, even the ones who don't turn their hips much, when they go back, what really happens is their left hip doesn't move much. So if I looked at you this way and you look at my left hip socket, when I go back, my left hip socket doesn't move out this way hardly at all. My right hip moves back and my left hip almost stays the same distance from the target line that it started. So when that happens, my left hip stays there and my right hip moves out of the way. All of a sudden I've created all this space that I can swing into. Right now where you're at is when you start back, this hip stays right there. That was a bad thing that was taught. Get up against a wall, put your hip against the wall, keep this hip there and turn back. No, 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 no. If you do that, you've moved closer. And when this happens, like I said, your arms go out and you tend to stand up a little bit, which is what you're doing. Now, if this keeps moving this way and you try to take the club more in and tip your, now you're tied up in a knot. So if you just get set up, get the tension out of your shoulders, get your knees where they need to be. Now as you go back, your right hip moves back as you put pressure into your right foot. Your left hip almost moves laterally and really doesn't move out much. So the further you keep your left hip from this target line, so there's the target line. Now watch again what my left hip socket does. As I go back, my hips turn, but my left hip doesn't move closer to that line. Here's exactly how your left hip works. And when it goes like that, you see what it just did to my shoulders. Now you get up here and now you're going to come down, it's going to tend to make you steep. Where when I go back, my left hip stays there, so when I come down, there's all that space to swing into. So those are the things you want to practice. One, get the tension out of your shoulders. Allow your arms to be a little softer in your shoulder sockets. Two, in your setup, we don't want your knees kicked in. That locks your hips. Three, when you swing back, as you go back, this hip has to move back. So it might be better to just think, I got to leave my left hip there, my right hip's got to move, but my left hip can't move closer to the ball. Once that starts to happen, your shoulders will start to turn on a steeper plane, and then you won't stand up out of it. The stand up and the little bit of steepness comes from what your hips aren't doing. So if you don't fix this part, and you try to fix this up here, which is what most teachers would go after, they'd say, well, you're standing up, keep your spine angle, you're a little steep, come more from the inside. That's not the problem, okay? The problem is what this isn't doing correctly. So work on that. I know that's going to help you a lot. You're already doing really well, but that's going to help you. You've got to create space. You cannot let these hips get in your way. You have to free them up, let them turn, let them move. The whole thing about restrict your hips and coil in and up against your hips, I get where that's come from, but the reality is most people that play golf, that really hasn't helped them much. It's just like taking your hands out of the swing, quiet your hands down. No, if you know how to use your hands correctly, you can't use them too much. If you know how your body moves, you're not going to use it too much. If you try to restrict it, then we start getting into some real issues, whether or not it's going to make you better or worse, and how much practice it's going to take and what it's going to do to you physically. Be sure to subscribe to my channel for regular updates and tips. Thanks for watching.